right, and we're going to have a little bit of fun with page 559. Well, I think it's fun. You might think it's torture, but hey, that's my job. 559. Now, we're working with another idea. We talked earlier this week about the least common multiple. So, least was smallest. Yes, I'd like you to jot this at the corner of your page because it's a good reminder. Common was same. Multiple was your answer to multiplication. It was the product. So that was the LCM. You used that to get a common denominator. Now what we're going to do is the greatest, that means biggest, common, that means the same as it did the other time. Same, factor, those are the numbers multiplied to get the given. Okay? GCF. This is the skill that you use to come up with a simplified fraction. And so that's where we are going to have fun with this. That's why I saved pages like this for after we have done some of the fraction work. So 24/60ths. We're going to take that and write that at the edge as if it is a fraction. 24/60ths. We're going to go backwards and say, well, let's say we added to get 24/60ths. Make your life easy. Call them both 60ths. All right, how much would it take to get 24/60ths? Well, I could say 12/60ths plus 12/60ths equal 24/60ths. Beautiful. Now, from this point, it needs simplified. We've done this before where you recognize that both your top and your bottom can be divided by 4. Well, no, you wouldn't recognize that yet, so let's do it by 2. That gives you a fraction of 12/30ths. But wait, they're still both even. So we take the 12/30ths and say they still have a common factor. If you recognize that they are both divisible by 2, that lets you end up with 6/15ths. But they still have a common factor. You can divide both of them by 3, which then leads you to 2/5ths. That can't be simplified anymore. Look at how many steps we had here. 2 and 2 and 3. We had to divide by 3 different numbers. If we could find a larger common factor, we could divide fewer times. Well, 24/60ths, I wouldn't necessarily expect you to recognize the greatest common factor here, which happens to be 12. You don't necessarily know your 12 times tables very well. But if I go for a greater common factor and think of my larger multiplication facts, I know 4 times 6 is 24, and 10 times 6 is 60. Now I can see more quickly. I only have one more step. These numbers are smaller, easier to deal with, and I still end up with 2/5ths. I did not yet find the greatest common factor to simplify. The greatest common factor here would be 12. I'm not so concerned that you can necessarily find that at this point. although it is a skill that sixth graders in the United States are expected to be good at. The skill that fifth graders in the United States have to be able to know is to get to the simplest form, to use a common factor and divide as many times as you need to get to the simplest form. So the numbers on here that are nicer are ones like 12/18. What fraction might I have added to get to 12/18? Well, I could have added 1/18 and 11/18. That would give me 12/18. Now that is the answer to an addition problem, you recognize I need to simplify it. This one, I do want us to find the greatest common factor. They are both even, but if it's in a question that asks for a greatest common factor, that means there should be a number larger than 2 that I can divide them both by. Well, 3 times 4 is 12, and 3 times 6 is 18. But by saying 3 times 6 is 18, that reminds me 6 times 2 is 12, 6 times 3 is 18. That is a larger common factor. To get to simplest form, then I just divide top and bottom by 6, which happens to be the largest common factor, and that's why I only had to divide once. If I go back to 12/18 and divide by 2, that gets me to 6/9. And then I still have to recognize that 3 is a common factor to end up with 2/3. By using the greatest common factor, I get to simplest form right away. Even if I don't use the greatest common factor, if I just use a common factor and recognize there is still another number that I can divide top and bottom by, there is another common factor, I can get to simplest form. In 6th grade, you'll have to know and learn and be sure you can get to the greatest common factor. The reason they hit this so hard is it makes it easier to simplify your fractions more quickly. What I want you to do yet on this page is, I'm going to change this. Instead of 18 and 42, I want you to use 18 and 27. Why? Well, partly because they're not both even, so you can't use 2. But by doing this, you should know there is a common factor. Here, I would like you to use 30 and let's do 45. All right. Now, down here for number 7, I am going to do something a little bit different. I am going to say, what if my answer here is 10/4? Well, how would I get 10/4 as an answer? Okay. I'd maybe have 3/4 plus 3/4 plus, do you see it? I'd have to have 4/4 to end up with 10/4, wouldn't I? With this as an answer, it changes as far as what the greatest common factor is. I don't want a greatest common factor yet, but I could. Why? Well, if I divide them both by the largest number that I can divide them by, which happens to be 2, I can then see 5/2, and it's easier to simplify. Take the whole number out and keep the fraction yet, if I'm just dealing with 5/2 instead of 10/4. I can get to the same answer. How? Well, top number divided by bottom number. I have 2 whole groups of 2, and I'll have 1/2 left over. So 2 and 1/2. What do I get if I take my 10 and divide it into groups of 4? Well, 2 times 4 gives me 8, so I can have 2 groups of 4. I subtract, and I have 2 whole groups with 2/4 left over. I need to recognize these still need to be divided by their common factor, and I end up with 2 and 1/2. So again, we're just sort of playing. First thing I want you to do with this is pause the video and get these two. See if you can, once they are turned into a fraction, get the greatest common factor so that you simplify them by just dividing once. So pause, see how you do on that. Okay, now resume. Here we go. The greatest common factor here is 9, because 9 times 2 is 18 and 9 times 3 is 27. If you didn't see that was the greatest common factor, you should have recognized that you could divide them both by 3, and you would have said 6/9, and that should have stood out to you again that 3 was still a common factor, so you got 2/3. This one uses the greatest common factor. What about 30/45? This one was a little bit tricky. I don't know if you saw it or not. If you divide top and bottom by 15, you get 2. 15 times 3 is 45 thirds immediately. If you didn't see that, 15 is the greatest common factor, which means there is a smaller common factor. In this case, you probably saw the 5. 6 times 5 is 30, 9 times 5 is 45, and maybe you even looked over here and said, I can still have a common factor of 3 and end up with 2/3 for that final answer. You should have gotten these, so now I am going to stop this video, and the next bit will be an assignment to do some practicing online.